And hypoxia can occur in any situation, right? Pneumonia can cause hypoxia. We can have hypoxia due to, it's hot outside. Hypoxia is the driver for that congestion. So hypoxia doesn't necessarily have to be at elevation.
Bovine congestive heart failure. Now, for me, I've always assumed it was the same as high-altitude disease or brisket disease. But in our cattle industry today that is pushing for performance and high growth in cattle, we're seeing it manifesting itself at a point in a time that is extremely costly to the feeder.
They were seeing a higher incidence than they wanted because late days on feed death can hit you right where it hurts most.
Dr. Kurt Ramsey, Dr. Paige Pratt with Neogen join me today as we discuss the concern of bovine congestive heart failure in our cattle industry. What is it? Where are we seeing it? And what do cow-calf producers need to understand about its applicability to your operation as well as its heritability of that trait in your herd? So it leads us down the road of utilizing our DNA testing ability to know where our herd is at. But it's not just to add another input cost. Here's another big reason.
And Superior came to us because feedlots had come to them and said, we would like the ability to identify cattle that are heart healthy when we buy them.
Bovine congestive heart failure. Are we overlooking its impact to our herd, to our industry, while a solution is available right there in those DNA samples? That's on today's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And welcome to the Working Ranch Radio Show. Justin Mills with you. Glad to have you for today's program. If you're a regular listener, thank you for tuning in and joining us here. Welcome back to the program. And if this is your first time finding the Working Ranch Radio Show, well, we'll welcome you here, and we hope that you enjoy today's program. By the way, if you want to go back and listen to previous shows that we've had, you can go to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, and you can find those there. Or if you have your own preferred podcast provider, you can find us there as well. A couple great shows we've had the last couple of episodes. Episode 211, which was a couple weeks ago, Alan Crockett joined us. The title of that show was, Are You Satisfied with Your Quality of Life? A deep dive and a discussion with Alan about that topic. Go and listen to that one. A great show. Last week, we had Rachel Gable in talking to us about the Maude family. As most are aware, the criminal charges were dropped against Charles and Heather Maude, and talking with Rachel about kind of what had happened in the past year, what's next with that, and why did it ever get that far? So if you want to check out all of our shows, like I said, you can go to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, or you can find it on your podcast provider as well. Now, the next issue of Working Ranch Magazine is in production, is in the works. However, if you want to pick up the last one, which was the April-May issue, one easy way that you can do that is stop by your local Tractor Supply store. And a shout out to the Tractor Supply store in Bakersfield, California, and in Vinland, New Jersey, as well as Galesburg, Illinois. Those Tractor Supply stores, along with the one nearest to you, you can find your issue of Working Ranch Magazine, or you can also subscribe by going to workingranchmag.com. And finally, just one more thing before we get into our main interview here today. On the next edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, we're going to be talking with two participants that were part of the Common Ground Summit that took place in Denver, Colorado last month. Now, if you're like me, you're kind of wondering, well, what happened behind those closed doors? Well, you're going to find out more about the details and the conversations and the tone and the topics of things that were talked about at that Common Ground Summit. I think you're going to be surprised with some of the things that you're going to hear from our guests on the next episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Well, as we jump into our topic here today, joining us on our program is Dr. Paige Pratt, who is the beef genomic specialist for Neogen, as well as Dr. Kurt Ramsey, a professional service veterinarian for Neogen. Guys, good to have you here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Well, we caught up back at the cattle convention in first part of February into January this last year as we were talking about congestive heart disease in cattle. And as I walked away from that, it was a shorter interview, and I thought, my word, this is really something that I'd like to spend a little bit more time on. So I have you guys on here today to do just that. And so before we get into some of this and really looking at, I think for a lot of us in the ranching industry, when we look at heart disease for those that are in the mountain states area, we've looked at it as brisket disease, or high altitude disease, as we have called that in some form or fashion. And before we get too far, I think, Dr. Ramsey, let's go with you first. I want to put just some definition when we start talking about high altitude disease or brisket disease, but more specifically heart congestive heart disease in cattle in this. Let's put some definition on it to get started, because as we work through this, we're going to bring it down to not just the folks that are living in high altitude areas where this is applicable to our discussion here today. So first of all, just kind of outline congestive heart disease that for a lot of ranchers, we've called it brisket disease or high altitude disease.
Yeah. So Justin, I appreciate it. So this is something that is really, it's fascinating. And I think we have to look at the heart in its simplest form, right? The heart in general its job is to pump blood, right? Bring deoxygenated blood from the body, get it to the heart, bring that blood from the heart into the lungs so that it can be oxygenated. And then the oxygenated blood can push throughout the body. That's the goal of the heart. That's the function of the heart in its simplest form. And it has to do that a lot. It has to do that often. It has to do that consistently. And it does that without us even thinking about it. So the heart is playing, obviously, a major role in the function of all species, but in cattle in general, right? Like, it has to do a lot. We basically assume that the heart's going to pump 1 billion times in that animal's lifetime, and it has to always do that. And so when you look at the effect of things like altitude and how that affects the heart, we can kind of work through high altitude disease is a good example of heart failure, but a lot of things can cause heart failure, right? I mean, we know that humans have heart failure. Congestion of our arteries and stuff will create problems with their heart. So in cattle in particular, if we look at the high altitude component, it's really summarized by the lack of oxygen in the environment, and that begins to affect the pulmonary arteries, or the blood pathway that brings that blood from the heart to the lungs. So in a lack of oxygen state, or an area where it doesn't have as much oxygen, the pulmonary arteries will become essentially hypertrophied or kind of congested, where the walls of those become thicker. Mm-hmm. And so then it makes it so that as the heart's trying to pump the blood into the lungs, it's a lot harder for it to do that because it can't pump as effectively into the lungs so it can get, oxygenated. The issue with that is that blood, if it can't pump into the lungs effectively, then it begins to put back pressure on the heart, and the heart has to work harder to compensate for it. The right side of the heart is the right ventricle, or the right side of the heart. Its job is to pump that blood into the lungs, and if it can't do that, it begins to almost balloon. We get an effect where it can't compensate for how much is needed to be pumped, and that blood begins to back up. And then we essentially end up with the brisket disease that we're all aware of, is that edema occurs because the blood's just not pumping through the system like we need it to. Mm-hmm. That can further become a problem. And the more that happens, the more edema that's occurring, the more pressure is being put on the body, the less able that heart is to pump blood, the worse and worse it gets. And ultimately we end in brisket disease so bad the animal dies. Mm-hmm. Or can't compensate anymore. Yeah.
So I think the news point that we really are going to camp on here today and flush out even more is the fact that, as you had mentioned, high altitude disease is a form of heart failure. But there's other elements and there's other factors that are part of this as well. So let's bring this down to why now we're concerned about this from an industry standpoint and seeing it showing up in elevations under 5,000 feet.
So I'll hit on it really quick. It's very interesting the way the heart responds to hypoxia. And hypoxia can occur in any situation, right? Pneumonia can cause hypoxia. We can have hypoxia due to, it's hot outside. There's a lot of reasons why the body will be in a hypoxic state. And this kind of the hypoxia we found, or at least the science has found, hypoxia is the driver for that congestion. So hypoxia doesn't necessarily have to be at elevation. And that's where I think we're starting to recognize it in different aspects. Paige, you might throw something out there, have some ideas too.
Absolutely. So I think they started to see those cattle in the feedlot, and I was talking with a group of folks out in Oregon a couple months ago, and a gentleman who used to run feedlots for Monfort back in the day said, this isn't new, right?
Really?
I saw this when I was, running cattle clear back then. And so I think the idea that we saw cattle that had the exact same signs of heart disease in a feedlot at maybe 3,000 feet or 4,000 feet that weren't at elevation clued some folks into why is that happening? What's happening to that animal to be able to help have them an increased morbidity or mortality rate in the feedlot when we aren't at elevation. We aren't in a high altitude area. And so I think that's where they started to look into, USDA Meat Animal Research Center has done a lot of work on this. Obviously, Simplot's done a lot of work on this. And so the scientists and the feedlot started to look into, why are we seeing these exact same symptoms in animals that are ultimately decreasing their performance or dying in the feedlot, but we're not at altitude? So I think, that hypoxic event, like Kirk said, can occur, when an animal hyperventilates because they're panting because it's hot, right? Mm-hmm. Or it could be that the animal's obese. It could be a respiratory disease. And we are simply looking at the ability for that heart to be resilient to that hypoxic state. So it might be from high altitude, or it might be from this respiratory disease, the heat, or the obesity of that animal. That is what we are measuring in regards to the newest genetic test that's available to be able to help folks be able to select for cattle that do have a more resilient heart to that hypoxic state.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And we're going to take a break here. And when we come back, I want to talk about some of the catalysts in our industry that's maybe seeing this showing up a little bit more. I think people, if you're listening really close to what you were just saying, both of you were saying, I think we can start to draw some correlation and as to why this is becoming maybe even a little bit more prevalent. In addition, I also want to talk about the genetic side of it as well.
This year, choose to unlock the full potential of your cattle operation with K-Line Irrigation, the affordable and dynamic solution for grass-based livestock operations. Beat drought by planning ahead with the most user-friendly irrigation system. K-Line systems ensure optimal water distribution across all acres and are unencumbered by obstacles such as fence lines or steep terrain. Don't miss out on untapped pasture potential. Choose K-Line to secure the future of your grazing operation. For more information, visit our website at www.k-linena.com. Be sure to fill out a consultation form so our designers can create an estimate for your project. K-Line Irrigation, for greener, more productive pastures anywhere.
Welcome back. As today we're talking about bovine congestive heart failure. And again, as we talked about in the previous segment a little bit, we were identifying that where we have often seen it in the industry or heard it referred to in the industry, or a type of it, I should say, would be brisket disease or high altitude disease. My guest today, Dr. Paige Pratt, Dr. Kirk Ramsey, both with Neogen, as we're talking about a little bit more to it and why we're also starting to see this, or not starting, as Dr. Pratt was mentioning from feedlots years ago with Montfort, that it's been around a while. We just haven't really been tuned in to what's going on and trying to identify that. Dr. Pratt, maybe go back with you a little bit on this and explaining, as I said, if people were listening real close to what both you and Dr. Ramsey were talking about in the last segment, you could probably start to draw some correlation as why this is something that we're maybe seeing a little bit more in that. And so I'll let you just flush those factors out a little bit more of why we're seeing that in our industry today.
Absolutely. So I think it is important to understand that with bovine congestive heart failure, we have some genetic correlations to some traits that we've been selecting for in our industry. And they've allowed us to make a lot of genetic progress, be extremely efficient, and decrease our cow herd, but to have the same amount of product for our end consumers current day, right? And so when I look at the data that has been published by Simplot, we have seen that it is genetically correlated, very strongly genetically correlated to carcass weight, to growth, to average daily gain in cattle. And so when we see those traits that we've been selecting for, as well as, I guess, dry matter intake, we've increased the appetite of those cattle as well. So as we've selected for bigger carcasses and cattle that eat more and gain more, then we've ultimately also been selecting for, because of that genetic correlation between those traits, congestive heart failure, in terms of, we didn't know we were doing that, but that is just the end result of antagonistic traits that when we don't have an ability to measure that congestive heart failure up to this point, we haven't been able to make sure that we've kept it in check. It's like selecting for growth and expecting your birth weight to stay the same. Yeah. Many times, right? Those two are antagonistic. So today, currently, because of a multitude of factors that include a cow herd that's pretty limited in number, a corn price that is very favorable to the feeding industry in terms of a pretty cheap corn, and the ability for those animals to continue to maybe be fed a little bit longer and have higher days on feed. Plus, genetically speaking, we are selecting for traits that are maybe correlated with that congestive heart failure risk factor. It's kind of the perfect storm, right? We're feeding them longer and we're getting them more obese. And so because of that, we're starting to see those cattle maybe be in higher numbers. And at the same time, when you walk out and you have 4 feet in the air, it's extremely costly today. And so I think that as those feedlots were experiencing those late days on feed death, they started to say, hey, I don't, this is what I'm seeing when on meat cropsy, I'm seeing that heart is very spherical in shape. It looks like a deflated basketball. And so when they were able to see that and they started to notice that they were seeing a higher incidence than they wanted, because late days on feed death can hit you right where it hurts most. And that is what feedlots will tell you is at 45 days to shipping, there's a 1% death loss on this really good pen of cattle that have just really gone to town and eaten well and gained well. And they're just the kind you like to feed. And the day you ship them, they're possibly up to 4%, I think is what I think even some mark research shows it's even up to 7% of cattle that on these highly impacted pens that have more mortality. And so when you start to see that higher percentage and it's late days on feed where you have all of these resources into the cattle, then you start to pay attention and decide that we have a problem here and we need to be able to start to track it to see what we can do about it. And that's what Simplot did. And that's what the Meat Animal Research Center did even before Simplot did that. And so we started actually this conversation with the Meat Animal Research Center several years ago and back in 2020, and they were able to find 2 SNPs that were impacting the genetic heart risk factor of cattle. Obviously, we continued to do research, and Simplot continued to do their own research in which they would score hearts there at the table when they were on the pluck of the cattle. They were able to score the heart on the table and be able to get a high number of phenotypes of heart scores. They started adding genotypes to that as well. And based on that information, they were able to determine that it was a heritable trait. And they were able to then also identify a very large number of SNPs that would allow them to be able to predict the risk factor of that animal to potentially develop congestive heart failure.
Dr. Ramsey, I want to go with you. And as Dr. Pratt was talking a little bit there, definitely seeing from the feedlot side of things being very relevant to know which animals have that propensity and those that don't. Tell me how this ties back to me as just a commercial rancher here in the countryside in northeastern Wyoming.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? In the end, we've done a lot for our cattle industry to try to get good cattle, to have enough cattle to feed the population. We've done a lot to do a lot with less, and so it's important that we continue to work hard towards learning about innovations, finding opportunities where we can continue to, do the best we can on the ranch side, do the best we can on our cattle feeding sector to get our beef right into the industry where we want it in a safe and in an effective manner. And so, for people, right, boots on the ground, our ranchers right now, it is a little bit hard because sometimes these feedlot, like our cattle, once we sell them, right, it doesn't maybe come back, or we're not necessarily seeing the other end of it. But I will say that I've necropsied a lot of calves. I've seen a lot of been a part of lots of autopsies on the feedlot side and on the cow-calf side. And I'll say that this is not something that is solely affecting only the late day fed cattle. And I think we need to start recognizing that as basically when we look at the research, we can find pretty strong evidence that any hypoxic state can begin this change in the heart. And that change in the heart, when we start to change the heart and change the heart's capacity to pump blood, those animals, the efficiency is going to change, right? Their ability to operate effectively is going to change. And so it does affect us even all the way down to when those calves are first born. And I think a lot of research is going to come out of that. I mean, I'm definitely not here to say that we know all of the ins and outs of heart failure, but I think that this is beginning to give us a little bit of understanding of really how big of impact this might be having on our cattle.
Yeah. So, and we're going to talk about testing because that's really one of the ideas. And we, before we went on air, is kind of the end game of this is we have a solution. We're going to talk about that before we get too far. Okay. Part of the testing is we look at that, and I want to hit this because we just got a few minutes left in this segment, and I want to hit this real quick if we can. We were brought up earlier on about high altitude disease, and of course that correlates a lot of times with seed stock producers pap testing bulls, or seed stock producers, some of them that pap test bulls and say, okay, we've tested for this. Let's talk about that versus kind of where we're going to be going with when we talk about the testing. And Dr. Pratt, you're talking about, the genomic side of this and that it's the heritability of this with everything. So before we jump into our next segment and looking at some of the solutions, let's maybe break this out and just kind of get the difference between pap testing and what we're going to be talking about in the next segment.
Absolutely. So pap testing really is taking the animal's blood pressure. I mean, that's what's reported is the blood pressure of that animal at a moment in time. And so when we talk about pap and seed stock producers that are turning in pap data, or commercial producers that are pap testing cattle before they select their replacements, they are literally taking a blood pressure of that animal at one point in time. And from those blood pressures at one point in time, they have developed an EPD. Some breed associations have developed an EPD for producers to utilize in the selection of cattle. And so if you are at elevation and you're trying to select your seed stock, don't get us wrong, you still need to select for cattle that are favorable to being able to withstand those high altitudes. And so certainly, those folks that are in the mountains at altitude, they need to continue what they're doing. What we're finding is that ability for that heart to be resilient to hypoxic situations, whether it is altitude or respiratory or heat, whatever it may be, that actually is going to be a separate genetic test. So the only way we can really do a heart score at this point is on an animal that is not alive anymore. And so we don't really have the choice, the ability to take a blood pressure like we do for PAP. This is actually going to allow us to test the DNA of an animal to determine what is their genetic likelihood of passing on a heart that has resiliency, or maybe they're less favorable and they won't be quite as resilient. So we can DNA test seed stock animals for PAP to be able to turn that information in and create an EPD. This is actually a genetic test captured the exact same way through the DNA of that animal for commercial or seed stock animals that can then determine, is that replacement heifer, or is that bull, or is that purebred cow, are they going to pass on favorable genetics to their progeny?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, so you talked about that test a little bit. We're going to get into that in the next segment a little bit more, and I think also talk a bit about, as I had asked you, Dr. Ramsey, how does this apply to me as a commercial rancher? I think there's some things we can go a little bit into that, especially when we start talking replacement animals. So let's talk about solutions when we come back here after this break. Welcome back as we continue on talking about bovine congestive heart failure. And part of the solution is identifying which of those animals are susceptible or have higher susceptibility to getting into that hypoxic state. If they get to that point, if they have that propensity to get to that point, then it leads to other health issues that we're talking about that can manifest out in such case. So we've talked about being high altitude disease, and also, as Dr. Pratt, as you were talking, and both you were talking about seeing bigger cattle taking to a weight heavier than they have been, which could lead to that as well. Okay, bringing this back to really any rancher, whether you're seed stock, purebred, commercial, whatever that might be. I think one of the things that I see this, and you touched on it briefly and just want to expand on it a little bit more, Dr. Ramsey, is the fact that what I see is, if we're going to do a DNA test, let's find out as much information we can with that sample, right? Because we have to take the sample anyways. I see for the commercial guy or any folks that's keeping replacement heifers back, boy, this is something to keep in these heifers, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that's what DNA has done to the industry in a lot of respects, especially on the commercial side, right? Historically, we would have never had an opportunity to take advantage of that on the commercial space. But that's what DNA's done. It's revolutionized our ability to really select for things that are important to our operation. And it might be different across the country on what is important to you, but it's giving us a window and an opportunity to make some really neat changes. And this is just one of them, right? One of obviously many. But the congestive heart failure, or like our heart's capacity to, be productive and successful and to deal with challenges, is a really, really important part of cattle health. And I think that's where it's there's some really great opportunities to make some changes in the industry right now.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I think about, we're going to get 2 points with this one. I'm going to go to you, Dr. Pratt, on this next question. We're going to cover 2 points with this particular question. Is, for example, not this past year, but the years before that, I was selling to a feedlot in western Iowa. And he was always good about kind of giving me an update on what's going on, and which was good, even though I had no money invested in it, other than I had a repeat buyer, which was worth something as a guy selling calves, as my steer calves, right? So that was good. And I think one of the things I felt bad if he was calling me, and we didn't have a bad death loss in our cattle, but if I was getting a call from the guy I sold calves to, and he said, "Man, I've got a 7-8% death loss," that ain't good. I think they even want it way less than that. And so to me, knowing what our calves have and the steers and the thing that's going to go on to the next guy, whether I'm vested in it or not, is valuable, and tie that aspect into also what feedlot producers are wanting to know and the work that you're doing with Superior Livestock.
Absolutely. So back in the summer, I was at the Superior Livestock auction with our feedlot manager, and Superior came to us because feedlots had come to them and said, "We would like the ability to identify cattle that are heart healthy when we buy them." And so we worked, honestly, it took us all fall to make sure that we got it right, because this really has been a test to be able to identify breeding animals, right? The animals that you want to select for in your replacement heifers or in the bulls that you're going to AI to or turn out with your cows. And so we worked with Simplot, who we have licensed this test through. And what we found was we were able to identify the threshold of the percentage of the calf crop that needed to be tested, as well as the score that they needed to have in regards to how that information is sent back to a producer for their molecular breeding value. And so we were able to identify for a commercial producer what that threshold is to be able to help market their calves as heart healthy. And so this spring, we were able to launch that with Superior Livestock Auction. We're really excited to work with them to be able to identify load lots of calves that are heart healthy. And they'll have, obviously, not only just hopefully that lower mortality rate that's associated with animals with late days on feed death, but also, as Dr. Ramsey alluded to, they will also be able to function at a higher level, at a higher capacity in terms of daily gain and efficiency, and have bigger carcass weights. And so it's kind of a twofold opportunity for those feedlots in regards to they're going to be healthier while they're feeding them, and therefore they're going to gain more and have bigger carcasses. And obviously a lower death loss is extremely important. And so this actually has come to us from the feedlot through Superior to be able to offer the opportunity for producers to test. And we actually encourage them to test replacement heifers so that they can use the information to be able to evaluate their replacement heifers and sort females based upon either congestive heart failure or congestive heart failure, in addition to other traits that we offer with iGenity beef, to be able to select high quality replacements that can stay and produce pounds of calf, as well as marbling and other traits that we desire, but also have that congestive heart failure that allows us to be able to satisfy that end customer. I think it's a really unique opportunity for producers as they are trying to improve their own herd, as Dr. Ramsey visited about, not only within their own system of making cattle that are healthier and have less trouble due to hypoxic states caused by diseases, respiratory diseases or other things that might be impacting them, but also to be able to market those calves.
Mm-hmm. Guys, I'm going to have you both answer maybe this last question or the route that we're going to go down to, and it gets back to a little bit the genetic side of things. And Dr. Ramsey, as you had mentioned, we can identify this. We can identify this propensity with DNA testing now, and that's been revolutionary to our industry. And so from a genetic and a heritability standpoint, Yeah, there are probably breeds that, and we're not going to name anything, we're not going to go down that road. We can identify those cattle, no matter the breed. And that's really the solution that we're trying to bring to the industry, or that you guys are trying to bring to the industry. And I'll have either one, if you want to answer that, I'll just turn it over to either one of you.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the reality is that there are cattle out there they're hitting all the marks, and this would be one of them. But like Paige always tells me, is if you're not looking for it, you can't find them. And this is our opportunity to begin looking for them. And you test for those cattle, and you find those DNA markers, you find those effects, those SNP characteristics that are what we're looking for. Once you find those cattle, right, that's how we make changes. That's how we've always made changes. And so, in my opinion, right, it doesn't matter the breed. It doesn't matter. We just have to start finding it. And this is our opportunity to start looking for those particular effects that can make some really neat changes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Dr. Pratt, you want to add to that?
Absolutely. So Justin, you said it's heritable, and that I think people need to understand. Right now, the heritability of this trait is running at about 0.36, which is very similar to a growth trait or a carcass trait. And I think as we look at our industry and we see the percentage of carcasses that used to wind up being select, and today how much smaller that percentage is of carcasses that end up being select, we can see that as we have selected for traits over time, we have made genetic improvement when we have highly heritable traits. This is one of those traits. Okay. And so I guess as producers take this information and wonder how they can utilize it in their selection to be able to improve their cattle and the health of their cattle, number one, I think we can arm them with the ability to select replacement heifers that not only have good heart health, but I always tell Dr. Ramsey, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's find the ones that do it all well. And so I think we can offer some solutions for that in addition to heart health that can help folks find maybe some females that last a little bit longer, that maybe have a little more fat thickness so they maintain body condition score and can breed back a little easier, things like that. But we also can utilize it in our seed stock world, being able to work with our seed stock producers to provide that information so that we know where we're at. If we tested our heifers, we can go find a bull that's better than our heifers to be able to improve this trait along with all of the other EPDs that we're looking at. So I think that as we look at both our bull buying decisions as well as the replacement heifers that we're keeping, as we move forward, if we're able to tackle it from both ends of the spectrum, then not only will the feedlot industry end up with cattle that are more heart healthy and able to be more efficient and have higher gains, but we as cow-calf producers will also get that benefit of being more heart healthy, being able to have better gains and more resiliency to diseases when they do occur.
Yeah, I had this written down, but we kind of already talked about it, but it really does just come back to efficiency. I mean, if that cow's under stress, our replacement cows, heifers, and they grow up to be cows, and they're a cow that's under stress heart-wise, we lose efficiency. So before we go, though, real quick, the testing on this, it is a DNA test. Talk about that process, how we'd go about finding out more information on that.
Folks around the country can go to www.neogen.com. There is a 1-800 number there on the website, or they can order it through the website. I always encourage you to call Neogen. It's located in Lincoln, Nebraska. You're going to get a human just like you and I talking to you, Justin, that's located in Nebraska. And they can get you to your local territory manager. So feet on the ground all across the country to be able to help folks understand what they will need in order to pull a DNA sample, how to submit that DNA sample. And normally once we get that DNA in our lab, it takes 3 to 4 weeks before we get results turned around. So be sure that we get those samples in well ahead of time of needing to make decisions. If we get them in the day before you're sorting up your heifers, it's going to be a little bit difficult for us to be able to turn around and help you. And so I think working with that person that is on the ground and in your area will be the greatest benefit of taking the stress out of the front end and then being able to help interpret the information on the back end. Because if you can't be able to utilize it, then we've done no good for you. So we want to make sure that we get someone there local to help you be able to input the information. But neogen.com is where you will find that information.
All right. Well, guys, Dr. Ramsey, Dr. Pratt, thanks for being here on the program today. I enjoyed the topic because it just gets to the meat of some things from a production side from an efficiency standpoint and genetic standpoint that a lot of us as ranchers need to know, need to deal with. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
You bet. And again, our guest here today, Dr. Paige Pratt, Dr. Kirk Ramsey with Neogen, fleshing out a little bit more on this topic of bovine congestive heart failure. I know it was educational for me because in my mind, I always viewed this as just pretty much high altitude disease, but it's really a little bit broader than that has some implications to any aspect of the industry, as we see both from a feed standpoint as a genetic standpoint as well. And knowing early on these cattle that have that propensity to be susceptible to hypoxic states and that stress that brings onset of other issues that could manifest themselves later on in the life of that animal. Some very useful information, and that, of course, Neogen providing that ability and that way to test for that and find that animal if it's going to be an animal that's going to stay in your herd. Stay with us. Coming up next, we're going to be talking about year-round mineral program. Does it pay for itself? Is it worth it? We'll be talking with Ted Perry coming up after this. And joining us on the Working Ranch Radio Show now is Ted Perry, Director of Beef Technical Services for Purina. And Ted, good to have you here on the program today.
It's good to be back, Justin.
We've talked from time to time, and one of those occasions we have talked on minerals. And I think we're at a point in our industry where there's definitely been quite a bit of preaching about the fact that it is important to look at year-round mineral programs. I think many, many years ago, it was more of a mindset of thinking, well, let's hit those certain times of the year and we'll just leave it at that. But we're going to just go and assume down the role of looking at a year-round mineral program and how important it is. And one of the things that I look at this is you and I were talking before we went on air, and you pointed out, we can have great genetics and we can have great feed, protein and energy in the feed, but the mineral component of it, if that's not there, we're not going to get the best out of those other three things I just mentioned.
That's right. And that's one of the things, you mentioned, we used to talk about when to feed mineral, when it's important, right through, before calving to build colostrum, to get the cows bred. And then we kind of put them on cruise control. But I think what's happened over our careers is we've seen these cows are getting bigger and they're getting more productive. So now we're seeing, and plus with what we're learning with fetal programming, we're now know that it's more important that we've got to feed those cows every day. And one of the things I didn't realize earlier, years ago, was that those rumen microbes have a mineral requirement. They require phosphorus for them to go through their fermentation process. And there's been some studies. Missouri has done some really nice studies that I've stole their slide ducks and I use it in almost all my mineral programs. But one of the things that shows really well is if you are low on phosphorus, then the rumen microbes can't utilize the energy and protein we're throwing at them. So the rumen microbes actually go through what's called energy spill reaction if they don't have all the goodies they need to complete the fermentation process, and we're just wasting feed. So, one of the things we think in terms of, as we go through the summer, when the grass starts to turn, that's when we really need to put phosphorus in there to give the rumen microbes the phosphorus they need to complete their fermentation process. And that makes the overall pasture and the forage utilization that much more efficient. So, as these cows get bigger and more productive, one of the things we don't see if we don't give them minerals is the cows, their metabolism rate just slows down. Mm-hmm. So their fermentation rate slows down, energy going to the cow slows down. Guess what happens to our milk production? It's slowing down. So that's why we need to have it year round. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of, and we're getting some good feedback on our end, is not only are we enhancing forage digestion of the cows, but as those calves grow, we've all seen them in the mineral feeders or feeding on the mineral tubs. That, again, is feeding those calves rumen bugs and making that whole thing more efficient. So the first item that I think of now when I think of mineral programs for a year-round program is we've got to feed the rumen microbes so that they can better digest them or fully utilize everything else that we feed them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that gets to the foundation of what you said. It's having a part of our good feeding program. You talked about some of the issues if we don't, and boy, that's where I guess to me, that's where the rubber kind of hits the road, because if we have poor milk production that leads to small, weak calves, that leads to poor immunity whether it's the cow or the calves, I mean, that's a matter of, that could be 30, 40, 50 bucks a head of profit that we're not seeing.
Sure. We looked at, I did some economics a couple of years ago, and this wasn't in a drought year. This was in a normal year. And we just took, grass hay. I live by Kansas City, so I just kind of took a local hay price. Mm-hmm. That 20% increase in TDN, or a 20% increase in energy out of the forage with average quality hay, that paid for the first bag of mineral in the mineral season. So we're always wondering, should I feed this mineral? Is it going to pay? The first bag just pays for itself out of increased feed efficiency out of these cows. That's not to say, and that's not taking into account, as these cows get bigger and more productive, we're going to see that number is going to grow, because as these cows get bigger, we've got to get more energy to them on a daily basis so that they can go through their production process. And that's still going to come from forage. From now through August, primarily those girls are on forage, or September. Mineral is key to make sure we maximize the amount of energy to get out of that forage.
Yeah. Yeah. Real quick, couple more things I want to hit before we go. One is consistent consumption. I think that's something everybody, as maybe over years ago of feeding mineral till now, I think when we think about mineral, we think of, okay, how do we get consistent consumption? Should we be seeing consistent consumption? Just talk about that element, because I think that's one of the, when I think about a mineral program, that's one of the things, okay, how am I going to get cows to eat it? Or do they need it? Is it one of those things, if they need it, they'll eat it?
Well, there is a lot to, cows will actually seek out salt and phosphorus. So those two elements are what we add to the minerals, and that's how we manipulate or make sure we get consistent consumption. Now, that by saying that, we've got different minerals just for that. In the spring of the year, you don't need near as much phosphorus or salt in there, because there's a lot of phosphorus. The girls have pretty much salt, but they have plenty of phosphorus in the grass. So if we throw this time of year, if we throw a high phosphorus mineral at those girls, the mineral consumption is going to go down. They don't get all of the other important things that we see with minerals, the traces. If we're feeding, for fly control, we want to get that going up at the 4 ounces. So by changing your phosphorus level from lower in the springtime when the grasses are really lush, as the grasses dry out and harden up, we need to add more phosphorus, because the phosphorus in the grass is decreasing and it's getting tied up. So that's one of the ways, by feeding the room, like we just talked about, feeding the cow, feeding the rumen bugs for the phosphorus, then that's going to help. That's going to help manipulate our intake program, and that 4 ounces is important. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we need to look at is the 4 ounces is over a month's time. If you look at any day and say that, gee, did my cows eat 4 ounces today? They're never, it's hard to do that. Generally, they're a little higher, a little lower, but over time, they're going to average 4 ounces. Okay. We've had years worth of 90-day mineral studies that we've done where we've measured intake, that over the summer, we're right at 4 ounces. But at any day during that, you can be off, anywhere from an ounce or two. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things to look at. It's a long-term project here.
Yeah.
And the other thing to think about when we talk about mineral, there's a good study out of Montana State that they did years ago where they looked at mineral tubs versus loose bagged mineral. And the loose bagged mineral, the cows, they hit that about half the cows hit it every day. And what they saw in the herd is that basically the cows hit it every other day. Half the cows hit it one day and the next half hit it the other. The mineral tubs, they hit almost every day. 90% of the cows hit the tubs every day. I think that has to do with the molasses. I think there's some attractant there with the cow and with the tubs other than just the mineral. So if you're looking for really, really consistent control, if you're looking for fly control, things like that, or we're real high, we're trying to get the organic traces or something else into, the mineral tubs are probably a better way to go with that. But both products we have over 90 days, you're going to hit the targeted intake. And that's important because if you're buying a mineral, that's the other thing to think about when you look at your mineral, no matter if it's our mineral or somebody else's. If it says 4 ounces, you want to feed that at 4 ounces because that's what That's what it's dosed for, to make sure she gets everything. Don't make the mistake of saying, well, I'm going to buy a 4-ounce mineral and cut it with salt because therefore I can save some money. Because what you're doing is you're not giving the cows what they need when they need it. And 20 years ago, a lot of people did that, but 20 years ago, a cow weighed 1,100 pounds. Now she's 1,500. So you're cheating her that much more on the 4-ounce cow, or the 4-ounce mineral. So make sure that you're feeding the mineral for the targeted intake, because that way she's going to get what she needs when she needs it.
Mm-hmm. All right, Ted, just a short time here, but one more thing I wanted to talk about, and I think it goes back to the essence also, one other aspect to be looking at when we're talking about year-round mineral program, and we've definitely heard more conversation about this in the industry, a study that came out of North Dakota State University looking at fetal programming, and that tying back to a good mineral program.
Yeah, we've done a couple of studies with the folks at North Dakota State. Some people may not be aware, but North Dakota State has a group of scientists that have a kind of unique skill set where they really do a nice job with fetal programming and pregnancy requirements. And we've done a couple of studies with them. And basically what we've seen, our latest study that we did with them is we fed heifers. There are 72 heifers on the study. Half got mineral, half did not. They all got a basal diet. Now, keep in mind that the basal diet provided about 80% of the minerals that they needed. So it's not like they were completely devoid or one of those, with or without. But the heifers the calves from the heifers that got the mineral during gestation, they weaned off 36 pounds heavier. They literally from tape measurement standpoint, they had a bigger chest floor, deeper bodied. So you made that bigger, deeper bodied heifer just by adding mineral during the gestation phase. The other surprise from that study that I don't think we were expecting was the heifers that got mineral, when they calved, they produced 1.5 times more colostrum than the non-fed heifers. So if what's one of the problems with heifers is milk production, colostrum value, and all of that, all of the things we see when we develop heifers. A couple of years, we're going to start, as we expand this cow herd, there's going to be more and more heifers, making sure this is just another reason to make sure that we get those heifers fed really well to get them off to a good start as a cow. And minerals, that data shows that the minerals are certainly a huge part of that. And we're going to see more of that as time to come. As we breed these cows for more and more productivity, the mineral requirements are going up with all of their other requirements.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Ted, if folks want to find out more information, where do they go?
Easiest way is PurinaMills.com. And within Purina Mills, there's lots of product information. There's also a section where you can ask the expert. And you can certainly send a message to them and they will get to our team. Mm-hmm. The other way to do it, talk to your local Purina dealer. Look for the checkerboard as you're driving down the road. If you have a Purina question, they can answer it.
All right. Well, Ted, thanks for being here on the program today.
Thank you.
Again, that was Ted Perry, Director of Beef Technical Solutions for Purina, joining us here on the program. Stick with us. When we come back, we're going to take a look at our long-range weather.
Looking for the perfect gift for a gardener or weather enthusiast? Introducing the Tropo, a precision rain gauge that has revolutionized both reliability and convenience. Expertly engineered by meteorologists, the Tropo gauge boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Today's long-range weather brought to you by Long Range Dewormer. Once we kick these cattle out to grass and they're working for us, we want them to stay healthy and thriving. Well, with long-range epinomectin extended-release dewormer, that can deliver up to 150 days of parasite protection in just one single dose. And what's that mean? Well, it means that those cattle are going to stay grazing and gaining weight without all of that extra parasite pressure. There was a study done a few years ago on yearlings treated with long range, and they gained 23 more pounds pounds per head compared to those treated with just generic ivermectin. Bigger gains and stronger returns on sale day, and it's going to start with Long Range. Find out more at longrangedewormer.com. Now remember, don't treat within 48 days of slaughter, not for use in female dairy cattle 20 months of age or older, and pregnant women should wear gloves and exercise caution or avoid handling this product. Well, as we turn now and take a look at our long range weather, joining us is meteorologist Don Day. Kind of typical spring. We're definitely an early part of this in the coming weeks, some warm up in parts of the country, but some weather coming out of Alaska that could bring some moisture into the northern tier of the country, or is it going to be a little more widespread than that?
Well, we're going to see another storm system come off the British Columbia coast and then bring rain to a good part of the Pacific Northwest, even far northern California. And then that's going to go across the northern plains and Rockies. So there's a real good opportunity next week for those areas to get wet. Then a good portion of Montana, I think North Dakota, parts of South Dakota are going to have a good chance of moisture. It's a system that's taking a path that a lot have this spring, which is favoring those northern areas, not so much the southern areas. And then there's another system after that the following weekend. So what we're seeing here as we head towards the middle of May is about what we'd expect. We've also seen some needed rain come into Florida, the southeastern parts of the United States down along the Gulf Coast, and they're going to see some more precipitation. We're also going to see it drying out like it normally does in the middle of May in parts of the desert Southwest, Central and Southern California.
Okay. Now, just real quick, from a maybe a 2 to 3 month outlook, is there anything you're watching that's just maybe a variation in what you anticipated, or are we pretty much in line with what you anticipated for this year for weather?
Well, pretty much in line so far this spring. A lot of folks are hearing murmurs of the summer forecast, and there's a lot of forecasts out there that are talking about a hot summer in parts of the central United States, and certainly that's a concern. I'll tell you this, though. There are a lot of conflicting signals in the seasonal forecast, and I'll have to tell you, my confidence in the summer forecast is about as low as it can get. And a big reason for that is we're seeing the Pacific settle down, going into neutral status, and some of the real hot, dry signals you'll get in the summer aren't necessarily showing up out in the Pacific and even the Gulf. So I would say the summer is a flip of a coin right now. If you're worried about hot and dry this summer, just keep in mind that the forecast confidence for the summer outlook is pretty low.
Okay. All right. Well, as we get a little bit closer and we get more definition of maybe what that would look like, we can expand on that a little bit. But appreciate you being here today, giving us an idea of what we have coming up here for the next couple of weeks, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Sounds good.
And you can catch meteorologist Don Day each and every morning through his daily video podcast. You can find that link by going to his website at dayweather.com. Today's weather brought to you by Long Range Dewormer. Find out more at longrangedewormer.com. You know, as we find ourselves here in the middle of spring and looking into the summer months ahead of us, time is always money, and wanting to save a little bit of time, have you thought about utilizing a remote water monitoring system? Well, what we've been using for the last couple of years is Tank Toad. All from the convenience of our phone, I can monitor the water level of my cistern tank tied in with a well controller. All of that, all from the convenience of my phone. You can do that with solar, satellite, or cell. Keep an eye on your water supply with a daily text message. If you'd like to find out more about tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more, give Meadowlark Solutions a call today at 801-252-6135, or you can go to their website at tanktoad.com. Well, as I said earlier in the show, next edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, we're going to have a couple individuals that were part of the Common Ground Summit that took place in Denver, Colorado back in April. What all happened in that meeting? What were the topics discussed? What about the ones left off the table? Why were they left off the table? And everything that happened regarding that meeting, I would encourage you to listen to the next edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show if you have questions about that. Well, the Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can send me an email. If you have questions, ideas for shows, send me an email at justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Be sure to leave a ratings or a review if you're listening via podcast. We appreciate that. I'm Justin Mills. Thanks for listening to the Working Ranch Radio Show. And until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.